Hey guys, this is Heen. I've been taking a break since my last video, and during that time, I thought about several things that I want to talk about in this one, but I've had some trouble summarizing all that nicely, so I think the easiest way would be for me to just ramble on and try to make things come together in the end. I'll start with why I've been somewhat AFK for the past few weeks. So, I recently started working as a part-time consultant to Shadow DotA, which is an analytics platform for professional teams. It basically has features that help teams evaluate the game from a data standpoint. And prior to this, I've always been very skeptical of statistics and analytics in Dota. Not because there's something inherently wrong with them, but because it's really difficult to pull off with a game like Dota. You're trying to break down the game in a way that it's insightful compared to the good old-fashioned way of having players watch the games and drawing their own conclusions. But like most other fields of competition, as the Dota scene grew, there's naturally been more tools to translate the game into numbers. And I think the appeal is that in real life, when you're having a serious discussion about something, you're expected to back up your claims with facts, and people want to do the same thing with Dota. And my problem with statistics in the Dota scene is that people automatically think statistics are facts just because they see numbers and percent symbols. And that gives them false confidence to form opinions and jump to conclusions. I remember a few years ago at the beginning of a match, there was a small stats box that said Anti-Mage versus Storm Spirit was almost exactly 50-50 in pro matches for the last 100 games or something like that. When you first see it, I think a lot of people might find that interesting since AIM has traditionally been considered a counter to Storm Spirit, but it didn't say anything about how the draft went, like when were they picked, what did they lane against, how experienced are the teams on each hero, and so on. All it tells me is that teams are not naive enough to lose so easily to one counterpick. I think what the stats were implying was that they're more evenly matched than most people think, which could be true depending on the patch, but given the simplicity of its presentation, I think it's a bold statement to make. Unless there's a high standard for how you process information, you're going to have a hard time enlightening pro players against their own intuitions about the game. And that's part of the problem with using statistics for the professional scene. There's just too few games as it is, and by asking specific questions to understand context, you just narrow it down even more to the point it becomes meaningless. In the same way, you might flip a coin 5 times and say, heads is much more likely than tails. What stats are good at the moment is serving as talking points for talents and fans, which is obviously not very insightful for the actual players. The panel can use stats for pre- and post-match discussions, and they're practiced enough to spin any stats to best type up a match. If it's close to 50-50, the work is done for them, but even if we're 80-20, you'd hear things like, this isn't just any Storm Spirit, it's a Sumail Storm Spirit. If there's one person who can beat the odds, it's him, and vice versa, regardless of what the matchup history might imply. And for fans, they get a nice recap of how a tournament went and get a rough idea of what heroes are in flavor. And I'm not at all critical of this since I don't expect anyone to come up with groundbreaking insights based on the depth of the stats that get used for production. In a way, that's actually how I believe stats are supposed to function in Dota, to raise questions instead of answering them. For instance, you don't look at stats and think Radiant is better than Dire. You want to find out what it is that supposedly makes Radiant better. Of course, there are plenty of stats that confirm beliefs you already had about the game, but you're really reaching if you want stats to tell you how to play the game and which heroes to pick. If you take hero-to-hero matchups or simple hero win rates, for example, I think there are some problems, like the most obvious being that Dota's not a 1v1 game, and the whole drafting stage is essentially taking turns to counterpick or responding to counterpicks. Or that win rate on heroes are determined by averaging out the data from all kinds of players that you could call most people. But if you have a really good player on a certain hero, he's not most people, and he will have answers that the 99% do not. I think stats carry little weight when you're talking about these kind of players in the same way you would maintain skepticism when you're dealing with stats from the legend bracket, even if it's across thousands of games. When we used to have casual discussions about counterpicks, I would often learn something new about a hero's matchup based on a player's expertise, and even borderline gut feeling without actually having played it. Some matchups that were considered common wisdom to swing one way turned out to be the opposite if you trusted your player, which is invaluable from a strategical point of view. And that's the other blind spot of stats in Dota. The so-called meta is largely shaped by the 1%, while most of the data comes from the 99%. It's difficult to account for innovation and the guys who are godlike on certain heroes. So that's pretty much what I've been up to recently, sort of a rather than complaining about it, try to make it better myself thing going on. My goal is to make data practical to players in a way that it actually improves how teams perform instead of being some kind of trivia. And that naturally brings me to the topic of preparing for a tournament, since you need to know how teams prepare to offer them something that might be useful. Players say this every year that Dota's getting harder. Before, it used to be about tier 2 and tier 3 teams closing the gap to tier 1 teams, but more recently, people really do mean that the game itself is more difficult to get a grasp of. We all know patches have been an essential part of the game since the beginning, but I think the way Ice Frog's been making changes to the game in the last 3 years has been different from the 3 years before that. Stuff that used to be basic, like how attributes, armor regen, gold EXP work, get changed so often so much, and then you have to wrap your head around things like talent changes and how that affects power spikes. I have a theory that as patches get better at balancing the viability of heroes, it adds more variables to take into account. Whereas if the balance is poor and you can label a good chunk of heroes trash or unplayable tier, it leaves you free to focus on the more stable and proven options. If teams have a few months of the exact same patch, they get closer to mastering the patch, which sometimes translates to we're tired of innovating. But the reality is that patches come and go so regularly that you rarely have two majors played more or less in the same patch. Every time there's a sizable patch, players have to readjust their bearings of the game. So when people say Dota's a complex game, it's not so much the gameplay as it is being able to keep up with all the changes and staying confident enough to call their opinions knowledge. When it comes to preparing for LANs, I like to emphasize how normal teams are, in a sense that the methods don't vary that much across different calibers of teams, other than player skill and maturity making the process faster and more efficient. For those unfamiliar with how teams prepare for a tournament, there seems to be some expectation that since they're professionals playing for a lot of money, they have access to premium information and advanced analytics, but I don't think that's true at all. I think there's hardly been an evolution of how teams train if you compare to the leaps made in gameplay and increasing skill ceilings over the years. They grind pubs to feel out the game and naturally develop ideas about what's good, almost entirely from what they encounter in pubs. The way I see it, every team has 5 sets of eyes. They go out and explore the game every day, then update each other on what they think and build strategies. That's no different from how you would imagine a new team with no LAN experience prepare for open qualifiers if they were serious about it. But the one advantage professional teams have is better networking for quality practice matches, and through scrimming lots of opponents, they find flaws in their strategy, then adapt, copy, or abandon them, just like they did 10 years ago. The only source of confidence teams have is the quality of their scrims, which is why you need to give some thought to decide which teams you practice against. You don't go into a tournament with the mindset that you've carefully analyzed the patch notes and figured out the game. The idea that you can prepare for your opponents in the sense that you anticipate what they'll pick and do is mostly nonsense, since there's a long absence of matches between tournaments. Especially in TI, where there's an even longer break between the qualifiers and main event. Also, teams tend to be more sensitive about revealing what they're capable of leading up to TI. In my experience, you tend to play most of the teams attending TI during the bootcamp, but when the tournament starts, you'll often see the teams you thought you were familiar with pulling off strategies you haven't seen from them. Saving strats is a meme, but there's some truth to hiding strats until the right moment, which is why you're better off spending time understanding how your opponents think and approach the game, rather than worrying about what they're capable of. On a related note, I'll touch on the mental aspect of how being prepared for your opponent in the wrong kind of way can backfire. When two teams meet, this is kind of hard to explain, but what happens is that both teams try to strong-arm each other into playing their game. It's like a game of chicken to see which team feels more threatened to change their draft and game plan in direct response to their opponents. Because it's one thing to have smart counterpicks and another to feel like you need to address everything your opponent is doing, which often leads to losing sight of your own game plan. The classic case of we seem to have the right heroes on paper, but how do we win the game? Weaker teams and even the best teams sometimes fall into this trap of reacting too much instead of trying to punch a hole through whatever they're faced with, staying on the mental offense. I think that's why good captains in Dota will never go out of business and why veterans stay in the game for so long. They're usually the guys that have experience to deal with this kind of pressure. Now, I think I've said a lot of things, but the things that I went over are kind of all over the place. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there are two types of approaches to the game, where one is analytical and the other is instinctive. And even though the latter is way more prevalent, I don't think the two are necessarily at odds with each other. Honestly, I myself would put more weight on the words of a player I respect over a mountain of data. But at the same time, these players change their opinion all the fucking time since they're only human and the game is always evolving. To be fair to them, players do learn a lot throughout a tournament. It's simply a side effect of trying to be both confident and humble as a player. So I think there could be a balance where thoroughly processed information can help players understand some of the less obvious relationships in the game. Dota's at a place where there's a lot even the very best players don't know or forget about until they've suffered a loss. And considering my criticism of analytics in Dota, I doubt there will be a day when players trust it more than their tens of thousands of hours of experience, but I do believe it can fill in some holes and give them an edge, no matter how small, for it to be worth it. Preventing even one loss could mean the difference between upper or lower bracket or being eliminated versus having a shot at bouncing back into the tournament. At the end of the day, Dota is just a game, and once you're on stage, you have to play your heart out and hope for the best just like everyone else. But just as one mistake in-game might cost you a tournament, the same could be said for a wrong opinion or a lack of knowledge. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.